Hi, welcome to another episode of Stardust and Golden. Today we're going to talk about tools. Tools are very important on a boat. Whether you're offshore or cruising intercoastal, you really need to have some sort of tools on your boat, and good ones. Not real cheap tools. I've been on many boats that had really cheap tools on them, or no tools, and it can be really hazardous out there. Look at your tools as your first aid kit. This is what's going to save the boat if it gets into real trouble. You need to have this like you would a first aid kit for anybody getting injured on your boat. If the boat's floating and the boat has integrity, you're going to be safe. If it doesn't, things can be disastrous. So let's take a look. As far as tools go, if you're sailing on a micro budget like I do, there's places and times where you can kind of take the easy way out and buy the cheaper stuff. And there's a lot of times where you can't. There's some tools that you cannot take the easy way out. And I'll explain that. I'll get into the tools that you have to buy, the good ones, and some of the tools where you can take the easy way out and buy cheaper stuff. I mean, you really don't need to spend $300 on a hammer, okay? Hammer's a hammer. However, there's some tools, screwdrivers, some sockets, and things like that that are not the same wherever you go. They're different, and some of them could be disastrous. They're not worth their money at all. So you got to really be careful. Keeping tools on a boat, unless you're really going around the world or something like that, there's a lot of tools you won't need. I don't suggest, unless you really have the money to spend, taking rigging gauges, compression gauges for your engine, unless you're going to rebuild your engine offshore. There's a lot of stuff you really don't need. But basic hand tools, yes. And some electrical tools, like battery operated drill, a must have. No matter what emergency, you should always have a battery operated drill. And I recommend battery operated equipment, especially cutoff wheels. It's a good thing to have, especially on a sailboat. If you lose your mast offshore or something like that, you want to be able to cut that rigging loose really quick. Also, if you have smaller turnbuckles and or smaller locks that you ever need to get off, a pair of these is good to have on board. This is a set of cutters, bolt cutters. And it's good to have those where you can easily access them, but they're not available to every trespasser or thief that comes on. You never want to give them the tools of the trade that they could easily rob you. So put things like that where you can easily find them, but not the easiest place in the world for a thief to get. You don't want to have them use your own tools against you offshore or if you're in a foreign land. So be very careful how you store some things. It's like a gun or a firearm. You want to make sure it's in a place where you can get it, but not everybody else can. Okay, as far as electrical, this is a really good thing to have here too. This is a powered one though. This is a 110. I don't keep this on my boat. This was just loaned for the video. But these oscillating saws are great for cutting wood. It's not something you want to cut metal rigging with or anything like that. But in an emergency, if you need to cut up a bulkhead or something in your boat really quick, an old door or something to patch a hole, whatever the case may be, it's a good thing to have a battery operated one. 110, I keep a lot of 110 stuff on my boat, but I don't ever go for it offshore for any reason. I mean, even with an inverter, you don't want to invert to power and run extension cords, especially if there's an emergency, because then there's no way you can run a power cord, and 9 times out of 10, your whole electrical system is compromised by the time you need something like that, or a bolt cutter or a cutoff wheel. So it's best to have battery operated tools. Even a battery operated circular saw is nice to have on board if you have the room. Tools add up to a lot of weight and a lot of storage areas. So you got to be really careful to make sure that you have the actual room for all your tools. If you're on a really small 20-foot boat, well, you just want to take the basic minimum. If you've got a 50, 60 footer, yeah, you can put a lot of tools on board. Storing them is another thing. Tools require constant maintenance. They have to be maintained, they have to be cleaned, and they have to be sprayed down with an antioxidant or rust prohibitor. You don't want to keep tools dirty and full of oil, especially used motor oil. You want to watch out for that because it's acidic, and it does have a lot high traces of carbon in it, whether it's diesel or gasoline engine. That's very unhealthy to have. The fumes are bad for you, and when it gets on your skin, it's cancer causing. So try to keep your tools wiped down if at all possible. I'm going to go over the tools first that need the most integrity. I've been on some boats where cheap tool sets were almost hazardous. For instance, I was on a vessel once where we had a small socket, much like this, on a breaker bar. And it was so cheap. It was made in, I think, Taiwan or China or something. And it actually split and broke and forced my hands down into motor mount, which injured my hands. You really want to be careful with having cheap sockets. One of the things that you really want to spend money on, if you can, or at least find good ones, is well-made sockets. Now, I keep Snap-on my boat. You don't have to go that route. That's really overkill. But find yourself good ones. I suggest 6 points on a boat, not the 12-point sockets. Use the 6-point socket, because 9 times out of 10 you're dealing with rusty motor bolts, or you have a stainless steel nut or bolt. And stainless steel is not the strongest metal in the world, and it's been fused together for many, many years, especially if you're on an older boat. Like mine is 35 years old. A lot of the nuts and bolts don't want to break loose. And putting a 12 volt on them is just at 12-point socket is asking for trouble, because they'll usually round the bolt right off, or the socket. If it's a cheap socket, it'll start spreading. So I highly recommend good sockets, 6-point. Use the chrome ones if you can. The hardened steel impact sockets are great to have. They really are. But they're a huge expense, and they rust as soon as they see moisture. These things will gather. I could leave these out one night, and the next morning there'll be rust stains on them. They don't last, and they're hard to keep on a boat, even in the best sealing structures, whether it's a toolbox or vacuum sealed bags. It's very hard to keep these things in good shape. So I would suggest the chrome. They're hard to grab onto. They kind of slip out of your hands, but they last a little bit longer, especially when you spray them down with like a Bow Shield or a WD-40 or something. Keep them from rusting. Another thing that you really don't want to take a gamble on is something like this. This is a screwdriver. I can't really show the name of it, but it's from a common big box store. These are prone to not fit. And when a screwdriver does not fit the screw, and it's not machined well, you're going to round out the screw 9 times out of 10. And this particular brand here is famous for breaking. You put these in a screw, you twist too hard, and it's done. It'll either twist or just snap. And tool steel's hardened, usually snaps before it twists. This is one that's actually machined to fit the screws for its particular size. And in an ideal world, you could put this is the flat-headed screwdriver. You can put the screw on here and it will actually stay there if you hold it sideways like this. That's a good sign of a screwdriver that fits the screw. Okay, it's very important. Your screwdriver should always fit the screw very tightly, both in width and in its thickness. Okay, the thickness of this should fit really tight into the groove of the screw. The same with the Phillips. Now Phillips, you got to be careful with the Phillips, because sometimes I have these tool sets. This one here came from Snap-on, and this has all kinds of little bits, and I mean just for everything. And what I like about this is it's made out of a really high quality steel, so they don't just shred and turn to butter. So I've had accidents though, because there's posi drives in here. Now posi drives look just like a Phillips. They really do. It's hard to tell the difference, but there's a slightly different shape. And I've gone into screws on my boat with some of those, and I thought that they were regular Phillips, but they were posis, and it didn't turn out well. So make sure that you're actually buying and using, if you're in the US, and most foreign countries use a Phillips. Now in Great Britain, that's a whole different story. Now anything made in machinery, motorcycles, cars, boats, anything made in the British Isles usually has a posi drive on it. So make very sure that you know what you're working on before you put the wrong screwdriver in it and round everything out. This is the same way as the straight screwdriver. You should be able to kind of put a screw on the end of it. It's a good fitting. This is a number 2 and a number 2 screw. And 9 times out of 10, it'll just hold the screw there. 9 times out of 10, not today, like that. And there it goes. But of course that is a little bit of a worn out screw. but it should fit pretty tight. It should, there you go. That's how it should fit. Now that's the screw at the end of the screwdriver, it's just hanging on there. And eventually, and now it won't fall. Get a hold of that. Okay, now that's a good fitting screwdriver. Of course, this was a screwdriver that cost darn near $40, which is very expensive for most boaters like myself who, you know, kind of live on a micro budget. But the screwdrivers and the sockets you'll find, the 6-point, they're worth their investment. It's a heck of a price to pay when you buy a whole set of these. And I would go for, on a boat, you don't have a lot of working room, so go with the short one. In the automotive and the motorcycle industry, I tell people to go, if they can only buy one set of sockets, to buy the deep wells. Because you can use a deep well a lot more than you can the shorties. A lot more usage for them. But on a boat, you don't have a lot of working room. And there's not a huge need for deep wells. So it's not that necessary. Now, this is a cheap set here. This came from a big box store. This was probably only a $20 set, and everything in it is basically, on a boat, this would be considered junk. Everything in here, especially these Allen keys, they round right out when you put them in a hardened steel bolt. There's not a lot of Allen keys on sailboats. Some engines do. So, you know, if you have an engine with a lot of Allen keys, buy some good ones, not stuff like this. This has no place on a boat. This should be taken home and put in the garage for working on furniture. That's about all it's good for. So be careful with that. Good set of drills. Hard to keep on a boat, but you're going to need them. Especially if you're offshore and you need to put something on a mast or repair something on a mast. Drills and taps. But they rust out constantly, so you have to maintain these at least once a week, especially in saltwater. Check them out. Make sure that they're in an airtight area. A lot of people keep their tools in foam boxes. I highly recommend not doing that because foam, in most cases, will deteriorate with petroleum products, and they don't have a lifespan. I've opened up some that I haven't opened in years, and all the foam had disintegrated, and it was just left a horrible mess all over everything that was inside the box. I like to use a bag, one of the carry tool bags, because you can stuff it with a bunch of rags. So in a seaway, it can be bouncing around, but it's not making a bunch of noise. Tools will make a lot of noise if they're in a loose box. Tool boxes, they're good as long as you have them packed so the tools don't throw themselves around. Plus, it's not good for some of the tools. And you always want to make sure wherever it's at, it's lashed down because it gets very heavy, especially if it's a big bag. You don't want that launching through a cabin if the boat's knocked down. That becomes a dangerous, it's a weapon now, and it's going to hurt somebody. So you want to be careful with that. So moving on, some basic tools that you want to have. A good pair of wire cutters and strippers, okay? You don't have to spend a fortune on those. Just buy a decent set to keep them clean and keep them sharp. Don't use them on steel rigging. Hacksaw, gotta have it. You never know when you're gonna be in an emergency and need to cut something quick. So I have sharp blades, a couple of those. Hammer, again, this is something you don't need to spend $1 million on. You can just go to the store, Sears and Roebuck. Well, of course, they're gone now, but there's a lot of other stores that sell a decent hammer. And I mean, how much wrong can go wrong with a steel hammer with a fiberglass handle or a wood handle? This is a tool set that was a disaster. I bought this at a lumber yard for my house. I took it to my boat. It did not work out well. Most of the items in here rounded right out, and you really can't see it, but that actually destroyed several screws on my boat because it was slightly rounded on the head because it does not have the integrity to handle up to the stuff that's on a marine environment. And most 304 stainless and 316 stainless screws do not have a lot of strength, especially bronze and brass screws. You shouldn't really have yellow brass on a boat anyways. But bronze, yeah, there's a lot of bronze and a lot of bronze screws. They don't hold up well to things that do not fit. So if you have one of these, I covered the name because I don't want a lawsuit here, but this is, it's junk on a boat. I mean, at home, yeah. One of the most important pieces of equipment I have on my boat is this. This is a hand impact for use with a hammer. And you're going to want, if you have an old boat, you're going to have this, because some nuts and bolts and screws will not loosen up without an impact. And we don't have air impacts out on the water. Sometimes we don't have the expense of buying a really expensive battery powered impact. This is the next best thing. I use this for some of my number 2 and number 3 Phillips screws on my engine. When they're seized up really good and you know they're going to round out, you can just put this in there, hit it with a good hit with a hammer, and it's out of there 9 times out of 10. If you need a little heat, put a little heat on it. But I swear by this thing here. And if you just spray with a little bit of oil, these things will last forever. This one here I've been using for 40 years, and I'm still using it. So it has integrity. But again, here's another tool. This bit here is not something you can go cheap on. These things will break right in half when you hit them with a hammer, unless you buy a good one. If you buy one of these from some of the big box stores, and I can't mention their names either, you're going to find that you're just throwing money down the sewer. Okay, so invest in those too. So your screwdrivers, this is a screwdriver bit, by the way. So your screwdriver bits, screwdrivers, Allen keys, and sockets. Don't go cheap on those. You're going to regret it, especially if you're off a lee shore and you got to fix something fast and now. You want the tools to do it. Another thing you're going to want to have is a set of good feeler gauges. I had a set here, but not right now. Feeler gauges are very important, especially if for some reason you're in a port and you picked up a vibration in your shaft, maybe motor mounts loosened up. On a sailboat, that's really critical. They have the long shafts. Sometimes if the motor starts shifting at all, bolts start loosening up on the engine mounts. Now you're out of balance, you're vibrating, you're causing disaster. All the bearings, the cutlass, nothing's going to work out well with vibration. In order to fix that, you need feeler gauges. There's videos, and I can probably do one in the near future on how to adjust that. But feeler gauges you're still going to want to have, especially if you have engine trouble. Whether it's a gas or a diesel engine, the valve's got to be adjusted. Not real often, but they should be done at least once a year, depending on how much you use the engine. If the engine starts getting really hard to start and it's got a really rough idle, sometimes your valves could have tightened up. And you're going to want to check this. You're going to need the specs on that. It's not a real hard job to do, but if it's starting to tick and get really noisy, you're going to want to tighten them up a little bit. And if they get too tight, the engine doesn't want to start, especially if it's a diesel. Diesels do not like to start if the valves are too tight, and they run like crap if they're too tight. And sometimes they won't run at all, but by that time you have other issues if they get that tight. This is a good set of Allens here. This was not a bank breaker either. You could buy these pretty much anywhere, but buy hardened steel ones, well, a good brand. Let's put it that way. You don't have to go, with the finest, but do buy some that will not round out and turn to butter in your hands. If they're chrome and real shiny looking steel and it says made in China or Taiwan on it, you might want to walk away from it. Okay. Made in Japan's okay. These are a must. All pliers, needle nose pliers, regular pliers. Have to have a set of channel locks too. Always keep channel locks, wire cutters, okay, or dikes, whatever you want to call these. These are worth their weight in gold. These are for cutting wire. I cut cotter pins. If they're hard to get out, I need to get them out in emergency. These are the best tool in the world for pulling out cotter pins. Split rings. Of course, I don't believe in split rings on an offshore sailboat. When I see them, I instantly cut them off with these. This is a must-have too. This is an adjustable set. You can reverse these. I try not to carry a whole set of the expensive snap-ons on my boat because that's $600 worth of snap ring pliers. You only need to spend, $10 and buy one good pair that's adjustable, okay, or has interchangeable tips. That's the best way to go. And you can have one set. You're not filling up the toolbox with extra stuff. And there's snap rings all over a lot of the engines. Back to here's the feeler gauges. Back to these, we want to make sure that these are always kept clean too, because these will rust out in the wink of a baby's eye. I mean, it takes seconds for these things to get wet and all of a sudden turn into a rusty mess. So I'd watch that. You can also use these for finding magnetic fields or testing magnetic fields. If you have a starter, or you could test your alternator to make sure the exciter is working. Just hold this really close to the back of the, take a real thin one, a real thin gauge, hold it to near the back of the alternator an eighth of an inch away, and turn the key on, and if all of a sudden it pulls in, your exciter circuit's working and it's energizing the magnetic field. We don't have a lot of alternators with permanent magnetic fields on boats, so this is something that you want to keep handy. Several sizes of these are good. Adjustable wrench, some people call them by their brand name, crescent wrench, but this one here is a rigid, so it's a rigid wrench, but I swear by that. Now it's the perfect size, but you can get a 10-inch, 6-inch, and maybe a 14-inch, good to have on a regular boat. And this is a great tool too, especially if you have a stud or something like that that's broken and you need to get out. This is kind of like an automatic spanner wrench. Also, if you got a nut that's giving you some trouble and it's already rounded off, this can help with that. Or even a screw head if it's a Philister type screw with the high head, which is worth their weight in gold on a boat. I try to replace a lot of the pan heads on the engine with Philister screws. And if you can find them, use them, because they're always easy to get off if they round out or anything happens to them. Flashlight, extremely important. So that is the basics of the tools. Always have yourself a knife. The drill bit we went over, the cutoff tool. Got to have a cutoff tool, especially if you're on a sailboat and you lose a rig. The last thing you want is that rig punching a hole through the side of your hull and sending her down. So if you have a good cutoff wheel, you could send that rig right to the bottom as fast as you can. Keep the boom, because you could use that for a jury rig. But you want to get anything that's hanging off of a boat in a really bad seaway away from that boat before she knocks a hole in her. Okay, so that's about it for the tools. I might do more. If there's any requests, please say so. Leave a comment, and we can go over more of this tool section at a later date. And we do have a lot of future winter projects coming up really shortly. We'll be adding more videos as the weeks go by here, because we have a ton of work on our boat. We'll be covering most of the steps on video for you. And if you have any requests, please let us know. So thank you very much for watching.